Hi, in this particular topic, we're going to start talking about mental health a little bit. And we'll start up with some culture bound syndromes and talk about how mental disorders can be very, very tied to cultural beliefs. And we'll move into some universal syndromes, which may have very radically different manifestations in different cultural contexts, despite being the same disorder. Ha, got it. And then we'll finish it up with some models of mental disorders, kind of like a way of thinking about and a way of treating mental disorders. Huh? So, when it comes to defining a mental disorder, it is not exactly easy. Even if you were simply talking about mental disorders within the United States, it would be awfully difficult to define. And there's been different definitions, statistical definitions, that is to say, um, you know, uh, an IQ of 50. An IQ of 50 is uh, very small, and a person with an IQ of 50 will have very, very, very many problems adjusting to their lives. But how about a deviation of 150? It's just as far away from the average, but it somehow isn't viewed as a disorder. So in some kind of a ways you can quantify, and there have been attempts to quantify, and it's always been problematic because it's like if you have, and you can see this graph here with the overlying curves, and what's happening here is like, what is it? Oh yeah, the the very definition of a mental disorder is often like if you have three or more symptoms or something like that. Um, Maybe a deviation from ideal mental health, which would be really troublesome because what is ideal? It's very culturally based. So it's a cultural question. What is abnormal? But to me, the only way to me to define a mental disorder in somewhat of a global way is um, something is a mental disorder if it interferes with your ability to adapt. Remember, I'm a big fan of evolution and adaptation, and you need to adapt. You need to solve problems. You need to figure out things in your life. And if there is something that is interfering with your ability to adapt, then, in my opinion, you have that thing can be categorized as a mental disorder. And because of that, the skills necessary to adapt differ quite broadly from one culture to another. So, therefore, what will a mental disorder look like? Will look different broadly from one culture to another. But yet again, it's all about adapting to the demands of your cultural needs. Okay. So, just as a start, we find Dot syndrome is a mental disorder that is primarily felt by men in Southeast Asia. And Dot syndrome is really tied into the fact that in the cultures that experience this, they have a very interesting belief system about masculinity that and we've seen this before, that when a baby is born, the baby is born feminine, and you need to do many cultural practices to be sure that the baby becomes a man, and the essence of manhood is in fact semen. And they have some very strange listen to me, Mr. Ethnocentrism. uh, they have some belief systems that are pretty different in how difficult it is to generate semen. They've got this and I don't remember the details, but you do this much to get one itty, then this much to put them together, and then this much to this, and then this much to this, and then finally you get one drop of semen. And they have this belief system where it takes like 30 days just to make one drop. And so they think that it losing semen is losing your manhood. Okay, so you can imagine that this could be an interesting manifestation of an anxiety disorder. Okay? So when we talk about some of these things, we'll call them culture-bound syndromes. That is, they occur less frequently. I'm sure that you will find Dot syndrome in America somewhere, but probably if you do see it in America somewhere, it's probably going to be exhibited by somebody that has a Southeast Asian ancestry or heritage, right? So it's they're not a universals, right? So perhaps the most well studied of these culture bound disorders is hikikomori. And hikikomori is a social disorder almost, where it's usually boys. Do I have it on this next slide? Yeah, commonly affects males. It's much more likely in males than females. And what happens is um, they will just sort of shut themselves in. They will just quit. They will just stop going to school. They won't do things. They won't respond. They won't do anything. And it's a relatively new occurrence in Japan. And it just it 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 it's the result of the highly beyond highly competitive nature of Japanese society. And we'll talk about this somewhere else, I'm sure. But growing up in these cultures, it's like you're in a classroom with about 50 students, and you are constantly being ranked. Everybody knows exactly what the rank is of every other kid in the class. And to a Japanese parent, there's really only two ranks. You are either number one or you are loser. But I'm number two out of eight. You're a loser. Why aren't you number one? And so it's a very stressful thing, especially for children that do not have the ability to compete in such a market. Now you find that this hikikomori has been spreading. It has been spreading throughout Asia. And so you find this in China now, in Taiwan, in Korea, South Korea for sure. I don't know North Korea. And so different parts of Asia have different names for hikikomori. Some might call it homeboy or homegirl or super homeboy or in video game child or something of that nature. NEET, no education, employment, or training. Uh, some different things. And it is clearly culture bound because if I mean I will be ethnocentric again. If I had a child that was exhibiting these behaviors, I would not see these behaviors as symptoms of anything. I would see these as it's time to get your shit together. That's what I would see it as. So it clearly is not viewed that way within the Asian context. We find culture bound disorders which are also spreading. Eating disorders, which really, really, really began in the West with the increasingly thin, and we're going to get to notions of beauty later in some topic later. So we're going to talk about what equals beautiful. But as a general rule, what equals beautiful is that thing which is difficult to acquire. So in cultures where there's where it's difficult to get food, that obesity equals the most beautiful thing you can have. And in cultures where calories are super prevalent, like the United States, right? Then all of a sudden, the thing that's difficult to acquire is in fact skinniness. So it's a reflection of the changing standards of beauty that we are presenting. And now eating disorders are in fact spreading. And there was a fascinating study done by Ann Becker where she looked at the Fiji Islands. And the Fiji Islands traditionally had the ultimate, the more obese a woman, the more beautiful and desirable she was. I mean, that was just the cultural standard forever. And all of a sudden, they started to get cable television and access to westernized media. And then within about 2 years after they got access to westernized media, they started to have these eating disorders. And what was crazy is that, the cable was first established on the main island, then 2 years later, and then the outer, the next layer out from the main island, and then 2 years later, and then the next layer. So it was just, it tracked. As each island got access to cable, approximately 2 to 3 years later, in comes eating disorders, all the way up the chain. Another Southeast Asian disorder, culture-bound disorder, is Koro, and it's very similar to DOT, as we mentioned before. That it's most likely an anxiety disorder ultimately, and it involves the fear of the penis shrinking into the body, And again, it has to do with how do you define manhood, and therefore it is not a fear of necessarily the penis being shrinking, but rather anxiety that I'm losing my status, my social position, or something of that nature. And then again, other parts of the world, frigophobia, a morbid fear. I mean, frigophobia is a cultural manifestation. That is to say, of all the times I was in China, and I was there a lot, I only saw ice cubes one time at any place. You cannot buy ice. They do not sell ice. It does not appear in a restaurant. They would never give it to you unless you ask for it. And even if you ask for it, they probably don't have it. Okay, ice is incredibly rare because they truly believe drinking a cold beverage will make you sick. In the summer, you are supposed to drink hot beverages, and it is not just China. This is an Asian ideal, and taken to the extreme, frigophobia would be to take, so afraid of cold air that you'll dress in layers in the summer. And in another potential anxiety disorder, frigophobia, or not frigophobia, Arctic hysteria, where people will, experience these bouts of, and they'll throw off their clothing, they'll jump in the snow, they'll convulse, and they don't really see any precipitating factor for it. It just sort of happens.